Need more housing? Bring back a public bank. And the chilling global censorship agenda behind Albanese's X attack. Coming up on this week's episode of the Citizens Report. Welcome to the Citizens Report. It's the 2nd of May 2024. I'm Robert Barwick and I'm joined today by Citizens Party researcher and editor Richard Bardon. Welcome, Richard.
Thanks, Robbie.
In this week's show, we are going to give you a history lesson on how we didn't have housing crises in the past, Richard, because we had tools that we used for them, and we need to go back to that. Plus, I've invited Richard on again today because this issue that's come out on the back of the stabbings in Sydney, where the government has seized on it to push its misinformation, disinformation bill, has to be exposed because they planned on doing something like that all along. First, remember, this is not just information. This is ammunition for people to use to try and help change these things we're talking about. So the best way you can help do that is like the show, share it through your social media, subscribe if you're not a subscriber, remember to ring the bell icon. Comment below. The comments are excellent feedback. We appreciate them, and I try and engage where I can. And also, please donate to what we're doing, because this is, not information for information's sake. This is activism. We're going to be making changes, and we are making changes. I'll talk about some of that in a minute. And we need all the help we can get from the people of Australia. The Citizens Party is entirely people funded. So, before we get into it though, Richard, just a couple of updates, somewhat related to that. People would be aware that we've talked about in the show. We've got a series of seminars we're holding around Australia this year, and we've been doing them we've done them in Queensland. We've done a couple in Victoria now. In a few weeks' time, there's another one coming up in Victoria, in Deer Park. So if you want to come along to the seminar, please contact the office on the toll-free number and express your interest in coming, and someone will talk to you. And then we're going to be holding them in other states as well. So this is really important engagement because we're in a pre-election year. Pre-election is a pretty good time to really impact the major parties of government in a way that they would normally not like to listen to you and ignore you, but leading up to an election, it's quite hard to do that. So what we do at these seminars is give people the state of play politically, not just in Australia, but around the world, and a pathway of what we can do about it, right? So if you're interested, call the office and sign up to come to those. The other update, which is big news, yesterday, Westpac announced a moratorium on branch closures for the next 3 years until 2027. This is another victory of the Senate inquiry into bank closures in regional Australia. And it actually shows these Senate inquiries are quite powerful. We've put out a release to that effect today. Now the only thing is, Richard, do we trust the banks?
Well, I was going to say as far as I could kick them, but probably not very far.
Look, it's a fine line that we've got to walk here between having a healthy and justified cynicism of the banks, but also understanding that what we're doing actually works. Because Westpac wouldn't have even made this decision if it wasn't for the Senate inquiry. And the reason there is a Senate inquiry is because people, including the Citizens Party and people we work with, started really pushing for one, and Senator Gerard Rennick decided to take up the mantle in Parliament, and he made it happen. And this has turned into one of the biggest, most comprehensive scrutinies of the bank for decades, literally for decades. And under that scrutiny, the banks have started to sweat. They're actually quite worried about what might come out of this inquiry, so what they're trying to do is preempt it, right? And that's what Westpac's doing. The report of the inquiry is handed down on the 16th of May. So Westpac's going, let's get in now, right, and see what we can, see if we can sort of show that we're good people.
Yeah, jump before we're pushed.
Jump before we're pushed. Now, hopefully the inquiry calls for a lot more than that, including the question of, I can tell you now, the thing that the banks would be most afraid of is if there's any kind of recommendation for a public bank that comes out of this inquiry. Because they know how much has been discussed. They've been monitoring this inquiry closely. They know how much it's been discussed, and it's their worst nightmare. So that makes them want to say, okay, look, no, we're conforming here, right? We're doing the right thing. But there's grounds to be really angry though. So, for instance, if they can just carte blanche say, 180,000 branches in Australia are saved for the next 3 years. Well, what does that mean about the branches they've already closed?
Or 180 communities.
180 communities, that's right. 180 communities that keep their branches. But what does that mean about the branches they've already closed? It proves to you that these were all viable branches too. They were shutting viable branches all along, right? That's why it's so easy for them to stop shutting them.
Yep. If we could make Westpac go back and reissue that announcement from the Main Street of Coober Pedy.
Exactly. That's where you get really mad. But Westpac had the Senate inquiry was called in February 2023, and at the end of that week, the senators wrote to the banks and said, please pause any further branch closures. Westpac wrote a deliberately deceptive reply saying, we will stop any closures announced in February. And that allowed them to push on with 7 more closures that they had announced before February, including at least 2 towns where it was the last bank in town. One of them was Coober Pedy, which is 540 kilometres from the next branch. And so
of any bank, not just
of any bank. That's right. And what is in the Financial Review report yesterday? The CEO of what they call consumer banking for Westpac said, his name's Yeton. He said, we have heard the feedback from our customers that they want face-to-face service and relate in regards to the unreliability of digital banking and the distances they have to travel to the next town. And when I saw those lines, Richard, I saw red, because in the very first hearing in Sale, the very first thing that Senator Matt Canavan established with Westpac, because it was the first bank to testify, was that they had done zero consultation with these communities before they closed their branches. Zero. And so it took a very expensive, very big government-funded inquiry for Westpac to hear the feedback it should have already known just for talking to its bloomin' customers. And now they're saying, we've heard the feedback. And so these next 180 branches are saved for 3 years, but the serious ones that like Coober Pedy, they're still stuffed, right? It is quite enraging. The other thing about this is where you do get cynical. Commonwealth Bank has a 3-year moratorium, and which was also their way of responding to the inquiry, which was good news at the time. 300 branches saved by that, but it didn't cover Bankwest branches. That expires in December 2026. Westpac's 3-year moratorium expires in January 2027, a month later. So they're literally just copying each other to ride out this storm in the hope that they can get back on track.
Yeah. Let's see if Westpac decides theirs doesn't apply to St. George or any of their other subsidiary
Well, those are the things you've got to watch, right? That's the nature of the banks. And that's why the Senate inquiry must come up with something powerful to really shock them into understanding that kind of behaviour is not acceptable. And powerful of the type, there will be nothing more powerful than a public bank, because the competition from a public bank will blow that kind of disingenuous decision making away. The banks will realise, well, we can keep playing those kind of tricks, but we're going to start losing customers en masse to the government bank. And we're going to talk about government banks more right now. But anyway, before we get onto that, remember, look, we are walking a fine line. It is justified to be cynical, but at the same time, understand the power of what we're doing. These are genuine victories that the banks are doing under duress, our duress, right? That's the work that you're helping with in this campaign. Okay, Richard, let's get into it. Now, we want to cover 2 quite important subjects today, so let's see how we go with time. But the first one is really crucial. Need more housing? Bring back a public bank. Those who do not learn from history are condemned to a housing crisis, because the solution's in our history.
Yep.
And I brought along a great book, we'll talk about this more in a minute, A Bank for the People, A History of the State Bank of Victoria. And it's all there. It's all there. So let's think about this for a minute. Because why don't we learn from history? I've had discussions with the politicians, and I'll tell you why. They say things like, oh, times have changed, mate. Absolute, utter crap. The fundamentals of economics have never, ever, ever changed from the days of cavemen to the days of today. They are food, clothing, shelter, and energy. That's the economy. The economy has to deliver those to the people. That's the economy.
Yep. It's only the means change, not the needs.
Exactly.
And look up a thing called Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Yes.
Right. It doesn't change.
Food, clothing, shelter, and energy. And so for the cavemen, woolly mammoth meat, furs, fire, wood, and caves. Right. Now we're a bit more sophisticated than that. We know that, but those are the things that have to be that the people need. Is the economy organised to provide those needs? Right? How do you do it?
And if I could just have a language nerd moment. The word economy comes from a Greek term that means household management. So there you go.
There you go. See why we get him on? Thanks, Richard. All right. So of those four needs, Australia has a shelter crisis, a housing crisis. That's what we've got, right? A crisis in shelter. And the problem we have also, Richard, is the politicians want to look everywhere to address it except the actual solutions. Because the actual solutions is, it's like some, say, tradesman who's new on the job, say a carpenter, and he's trying to solve a problem, and he decides to, look everywhere except what did the previous generations of carpenters do when they had this problem, right? So it's that sort of thing. The news this week is Senator Andrew Bragg from the Liberal Party, who's now in charge of, he's not the housing, I think it's the affordable housing minister or whatever, shadow minister, whatever he's called now. He's proposed that first home buyers should be able to use all their super to buy a house. And I can see why that would be attractive, right? Because it's the deposit to save up to get the loan for a house is enormous now. And if you got, $100,000 or $200,000 in super, that'd be attractive. However, that has real problems associated with it, which are pretty obvious now if people didn't know them. And so Wayne Swan, the former Treasurer, who's now the President of the Labor Party, he tweeted today a New Daily article. And the New Daily article headline is, Liberals plan to destroy super will drive up house prices. Liberals plan to destroy super will drive up house prices. It just so happens, Richard, that the New Daily is funded by superannuation companies.
It's owned by the Industry Super Australia, yeah.
So they oppose this for that reason, right? They don't want a whole heap of money going out of super, let alone, they don't really care where it goes, but they just don't want it going out of super. Yeah. So that's their opposition. But Wayne Swan, though, is right, because if suddenly you've got all these buyers who right now don't qualify for a loan, but can grab super and qualify for a loan, but you haven't increased the amount of housing, all you're going to do is add to the demand, and that's going to push up the price of housing.
Yeah, haven't increased the supply or capped the prices.
Or capped the price. So he's absolutely right. Now, and he should know that. There's a reason Wayne Swan should know that. Because as Treasurer in 2008, straight after the global financial, like September 2008, in the middle of the global financial crisis, he tripled the first home buyers grant in Australia. And he said it at the time. He and Rudd and Julia Gillard and Lindsay Tanner, they got together, they're called the Gang of Four. They made a big press conference saying, this is a measure to make housing more affordable. But behind the scenes, you can read in the book Shitstorm by Lenore Taylor, behind the scenes, they actually, the cabinet notes show that no, this was done to push up house prices. They put more money, made more money available for people to put to their deposits, and all they did was push up house prices, which was their intention. So he knows how it works. It's just he's being a bit deceptive at the moment. So in other words, they say it's to make housing affordable. All it does is make housing more unaffordable. How unaffordable? Well, this is crazy. So the latest CoreLogic figures. Australians are now spending 48.9% of median income to service a median priced property. So that's not the average of all of them. It's the median, which is the middle.
The one in the middle.
The one in the middle, right? Of all the houses and all the incomes in Australia, the one in the middle, because what they call the mean average can be distorted by the extremes. This is the one in the middle. So 48.9% of median income to service a median priced property. In Sydney, that's 60%. In regional New South Wales, that's 55.4%. And why that's mind-blowing is what they call mortgage stress, which we were talking about a lot at the time of the global financial crisis, is defined as 30% of your income on housing.
Yep.
30%. If you're spending 30%, you're mortgage stressed. If you're spending 45%, you are severely mortgage stressed. Now, the median is way above 45%, right? And in Sydney, forget about it. And what are the two major parties offering? More of the same, right? Neoliberal rubbish. Because it's all about a pathetic amount on social housing. And by pathetic, Albo's initial plan was $500 million a year. And now, as a one-off, there's a $2 billion injection. But it's tiny compared to the demand.
And it's not actually going to build housing. It's all this market incentives crap.
Exactly. That's the neoliberal element. So it's incentives for the private sector to build the housing. Don't the government just get into it itself? No, it can't do that. And then policies like Bragg's to drive up demand, but then also policies like Albanese's immigration policy to drive up demand. So they're going to attack Bragg saying, oh, you're going to make housing more expensive. Well, their whole immigration policy at the moment is to make housing more expensive.
And that's all it's for. It's to juice up the GDP numbers while collapsing GDP per capita for the migrants and the people already here, and to help the banks out by propping up house prices.
If you know the Citizens Party long enough, you will know that we are actually the most pro-immigration party in Australia. But we've never...
We're big Australia, like the Titanic was a big boat.
That's right. We are never the idea of cramming people into Melbourne and Sydney to push up a housing bubble. We're talking about developing Australia, the potential we have, and you could bring in a lot more people and you could encourage a lot more higher birth rates, but spread out around the country in a way that hardly anyone noticed. People wanting to move to towns like the beautiful town of Carnama that I got to visit in the bank branch's inquiry, where they had a hearing there, where that poor town, it's surrounded by all this wealth, but the town is a ghost town almost, right? And they lost their last bank and they're crying out for people to come and live there. There's places like that all around Australia. And instead, the government has an immigration policy that's about cramming people into Melbourne and Sydney and Brisbane to push up the housing market, because that's what the banks are most exposed to. Now, this, Richard, is where it gets interesting, because the Greens have a policy that people need to think through here. It's an interesting idea of a public housing authority for the government to actually get in and build the housing itself. They say what they're proposing could build 360,000 homes in 5 years, 600,000 in 10 years. And so when you hear figures like that, people are going to say, oh, is that even possible, right? Apart from all the sniping that the major parties are going to do. And I'll say it now, and I've said it before, we are not the Greens. We're very different political parties to the Greens, but I don't mind engaging with the Greens, because what you see is what you get. You know what you agree on and you know what you disagree on. And I tend to find that we actually find a bit of common ground on the things that are not their core issue. Like when they're not talking green policy, you can actually find, speaking for myself and the Citizens Party now, we can actually find a bit of common ground. And so this is an interesting proposal. So is it even possible? Well, let's look at the history. Listen carefully what I'm about to say. What if we said that we could have a public housing authority that builds 1/3 of all housing in the economy, 1/3, is financially self-sufficient and profitable, so it costs the budget nothing, no cost to the annual budget, makes its own profit and is financially self-sufficient, and provides the housing at a fixed cost of no more than 15 to 20% of income. Consider the contrast to what we just went through. 48.9% is the median.
That's the median. This is 20% max.
20% max. Now think about that for a minute. And some people are going to be instantly going, oh, you're in La La Land. Fairy tale stuff. Who did it, Richard?
A very patrician blue blood gentleman, not some socialist.
Not some socialist.
Called Sir Thomas Playford, I believe the fourth.
Yeah, I think so.
Of the Premier of the benevolent dictator of South Australia for 30-odd years.
He was the 38 or 36 to 65?
Yeah, I think it was 38 to 65, and he was around in politics for quite a while before that.
So he dominated South Australia politics. He was not Labor. He was on the Liberal and Country Leagues, I think.
It was one of the precursors to the Liberal Party now.
He did this. 1/3 under him and the South Australian Housing Trust, it was called. 1/3 of all housing was built by this trust. All housing. The trust was self-sufficient and profitable, didn't cost the budget anything, and the housing was provided at a fixed cost of no more than 15 to 20% of income. And examples. What's the suburb you referenced?
There's Elizabeth, and there's another one beside it. They set up these new industrial cities, not just building housing, but they built whole new planned communities. They built the roads in and out. They built the factories. They laid they put in the power lines. They laid the sewerage. Everything.
Yep. That's so. Let's just put that as the bookend, right? I mean, people have got to contemplate this sort of thing for a minute. That's what this country once did. That was not some red rag socialist. Because a few other examples we're going to give is the next one is a Labor government, right? But that was not that. This was someone who used the power of government to great effect for the benefit of the people of South Australia.
Yeah, and they also built these build-to-rent houses, but they actually kept it affordable, the same as they did with them.
And that's no different. There's very little difference in what he did to what the Greens are proposing, and the two major parties are ridiculing the hell out of him for doing it, right? The thing is, they've done their historical homework. The Greens MP who leads on this is Max Chandler Mather, the young man from Brisbane. The first time I ever read Max, he was writing a history article. I know he's done his homework on some of this. So, we have an article on this in our weekly magazine this week, written by Elisa Barwick, the Australian Alert Service. And the name of the article is The State Bank Model for a Public Housing Developer, because that's actually not the example we want to get into. But in the article, the quote, I'll just read the quote from the article. The vehicle for the program, the South Australian Housing Trust, was established as a statutory agency in 1936. Effectively a state-owned company, it operated as a planning and development authority for the state, rolling out infrastructure from roads to playgrounds and even new cities. It built 1/3 of all South Australian homes in 1945 to 1970. So it kept going for 5 years after Playford was no longer Premier. At its peak, the SAHT became the state's biggest property developer, generating its own revenue stream and costing the taxpayer nothing. It was also the biggest landlord to renters, but charged only economic rents rather than market rates, fixed at 1/5 to 1/6 of income. Compare that to today's 50% plus proportion of income spent on rent. So there's an example from history. Another one, the biggest expansion of public housing in Australia was actually in the decade after World War II. And the way that was done, Ben Chifley was the Prime Minister of Australia. He actually used the Commonwealth Bank, and the Commonwealth Bank loaned money to all the state governments to start housing commissions, and they built the housing with loans from the Commonwealth Bank.
And as completely opposite to what we were talking about before with this immigration program that Albanese's running and pretending he isn't right now, They built that. They brought more migrants in proportionally during that period than what they're doing now. Much higher percentage. But they employed them to build the cities and towns they were going to live in, and the roads to get there, and the Snowy scheme, and they had all these other big plans that never happened because Menzies killed them. But anyway.
All right, but and in that decade they built 90,000 public houses through that model of the Housing Commission. But we're going to go back even further in history now, which is why I brought this book here, which was the purpose of this article that Elise has written. We're talking about the amazing success story, at least by today's standards, of the State Savings Bank of Victoria's housing program in the 1920s. What they did. So I just want to go through some of the details. The state, and this is the power of a public bank, by the way. So the State Savings Bank started in the 1840s in Victoria, but in the 1890s there was probably a deeper depression than the 1930s depression.
1893.
And the State Savings Bank set up what is called a credit foncier department, which is a French term, and essentially it was this: it was to provide loans to farmers on fixed terms. So the farmers had they had their everything about the loan was guaranteed. They knew it was what the payments would be, the time frame, and they weren't going to have the loan called in like they did by the private banks, right? The private banks had foreclosed on so many loans. These kind of loans, the foncier bit meant they wouldn't be foreclosed on, right? If the farmer could serve them.
Yeah, and unlike the way that things work now, because this is a state bank, they can defer repayments in a bad season, or if there's a flood or something like that. The banks today could do, but that would eat into their profits.
Exactly. So, and I'm glad you said that, because people have to understand. Whereas a private bank is just going to maximise its profits at every turn and not be flexible, a public bank can be flexible because they know in the long run they'll always make a profit, always. But in the short term, they can say, okay, we can help you out here, etc., and keep people on the land in this case. So that worked, and it stopped many foreclosures after 1890. So in 1910, the State Savings Bank started to apply credit foncier terms to housing loans. They said, let's do this for housing loans as well. And that helped people buy housing. But then in 1920, they really ramped this up. But what they did was, I'm going to read a section from the article, which is a quote from a gentleman named Arnold Atkinson, who actually gave a speech on this back in the 1990s at the Probus Club in Melbourne. This is his account. He goes, in 1921, a chief architect was appointed to head up a building department employing architects, clerks of works, and valuers. A building department of the bank. They set up its own building department. By the mid-20s, the bank had become the biggest home builder in the state. The bank was the builder. In the absence then of any building regulations, the bank set the standards for home building with its rigid specifications of the best materials and best supervision carried out under supervision by its clerks of works. Some of the suburbs developed in the 20s bear the bank's imprint in every street. The most fetching line in the estate agent's advertisement in those days was, built under bank supervision. There was no need to ask which bank, everyone knew. And we'll put we've used Trove to find an ad actually from the time where you see this line, built under bank supervision.
Bank with a capital B.
That was the blue ribbon on the house, right? People wanted that bank, that house if the bank built it. So this bank doesn't just provide finance, it supervised the construction from start to finish. Now, one of its champion projects was actually a thing called Garden City, a development called Garden City, which is at Fisherman's Bend in Port Melbourne. And we've got some photos here, there's at least one in colour, of the kind of, it's on the back page of the alert here. It's amazing. These were architect designed homes. This is a 2-storey house, and this was very common in this Garden City development. Some of the other pictures in the book are of 1-storey homes in places like suburbs like Preston. But they built these 2-storey homes in Garden City. Now, I got some quotes to go with it. I'll just read this from the article. what they were thinking of was they wanted wharf workers and their families not to have to crowd into dingy single rooms or the men cycle home at midnight in darkness when there was ample potential for housing right there. And so they built this housing development. Now the Herald, the Melbourne Herald, on 23 December 25, this is the quote, "The basis of the Victorian scheme is home ownership for the people, and here it has probably been developed further than in any other part of the world, and there is not the slightest doubt that it gives a great sense of security and domestic responsibility to the people as a whole." And then this is an even better quote. Sir William McBeath, chairman of the bank's board of commissioners, noted the new era of town planning it represented, saying every man, quote, "should try to possess a home. It made for the stability of the country generally and made people take an interest in the government and the finance of the country." He says that. You want to get people interested in being responsible citizens? Make sure we have a system that allows them to buy a home.
Yep. That's a bit of a contrast to the bank executives of today, isn't it? With Matt Common telling you he wants you to not be allowed to spend your own cash and all this other nonsense.
Well, Richard, I'm glad you said so, because I have a little ad to play. Now, so this is the State Savings Bank. If you're a viewer who's been around a while, in other words, I'm saying you might be a bit old, you would remember the Victorian State Bank in its days of infamy. It collapsed in infamy in the late 1980s. And that gets used by absolutely idiots. Idiot politicians in Parliament tell me, oh, we can't have a public bank. Look at the Victorian State Bank, the South Australian State Bank. Oh, you absolute morons. These things lasted 100 years, more than 100 years, absolutely, perfectly successfully, until other factors, including deregulation, got them into speculation in the 80s. And in a few years in the 80s, it undid all their good work. Yep. But before that happened, there was a different banking culture back then. So this is actually an ad from the 80s I'm going to play now. All right, got it off YouTube. And just think about what you just said, right, where the banks want to change the culture that we expect, in terms of how banking should work. And so now if you even go to line up and get money out, they want to say, what do you, it's like as if it's not your money. Well, look at this ad.
The phone bill? I thought you were going to pay that out of your cheque account.
Well, there's no money left in it.
Well, use the other one.
No, I can't touch that for about another month.
But it's your money, Ralph.
Yes, but then the interest
Yeah, but it's still your money.
When the state bank launched the state banking system, it put 400,000 Victorians back in control of their money.
Well, let's pull some out of your interest-bearing deposit.
If you're still out of control, come and see us.
You've got to wait 90 days for that one.
So what were you saying about your money?
So all right. So there's a good example of the state bank, understanding its place in society, even as it was losing its way back in the 80s. But that also reflects, like I said, the difference in the culture that's so different now. But back to the 1920s. Here's a report from the time. They had this mandate. Let's go and build housing. So they went and study how's the best way to do it. The term Garden City was actually a phenomenon. It was a movement around the world, especially in the UK. So they went to the UK to study what they were doing, how were they procuring the supplies, etc., and they came down here and did it better. They came back and did it better, basically, and it was world class. The report at the time was the Fisherman's Bend project, with architect design homes, road layout, fencing and sewerage, all contracted by the bank, was overwhelmed with applications. Now, we're going to come back to the Greens now. In 1 year, 1922 to 1923, the State Savings Bank of Victoria built 5,000 homes. And I'm looking at that figure and I'm going, whoa, like a government today, the federal government would, if they built 5,000 homes in a year, would be dancing from the rooftop saying, look what we've done. The State Bank, 1921-22 financial year, built 5,000 homes. So what does that mean? How does that compare proportionally to now? Because the Greens have proposed 360,000 homes in 5 years, right? Well, it's actually more than in line. It's beating what the Greens are proposing, because at that time, I didn't look up Victoria's population, but Australia's population was 5.4 million people, It's now 5 times that at 27 million people. But if you take that 5,000 figure and extrapolate it across Australia, you're talking about between 20,000 and 30,000 homes in a year. Well, the Greens figure broken down to annually is 72,000. So at a time when we had 1/5 of the population, we were capable of building the equivalent of 20 to 30,000 homes in a year, whereas the Greens now are saying with 5 times the population, let's build 72,000 homes in a year. And I'm not doing this to praise the Greens. They're the ones that have put up this proposal. What I'm saying is it's on the money. It's the right proposal because the system, they've gone back in history and say this is what we used to do. This works, and it works. So learn your history, people. If you want to read this article and you don't subscribe to the alert service, you should subscribe to the alert service and call in and get a subscription. But if you've never received an alert service before, we do have a service where you can get a free one as a one-off. You can call in and ask for that. It's an exceptional article on this. We need to cut through the neoliberal Gordian knot and go back to these actual solutions. All right, let's move on, Richard, because now's your time to shine. The chilling global censorship agenda behind Albanese's X attack. X meaning Twitter.
Yeah. Right.
So people, I'm sure, are familiar with the big flat between Albanese and Elon Musk in the last week or so. There's a much bigger thing at play here, which Richard's going to go through. But we're talking about misinformation and disinformation. Those are the buzzwords of the day, right? Well, we have another word called propaganda we like to use as well, especially because with the government's bill for misinformation, disinformation, they exempt anything from the government or from the mainstream media as being classified as mis or disinformation. How self-serving is that? But we know these governments are responsible for actual propaganda. So we want to give, before we get into the guts of it, let's just highlight 2 recent examples. The first one is, Richard, there was a bit of a change of tone by someone very significant this week. Professor James Curran, who's a history professor at Sydney Uni, and he's now I think he's an AFR editor.
Yeah,
right?
he's the international affairs editor for the AFR as well now.
So he wrote something relating to Russia and Ukraine that actually flies in the face of everything that Albanese and Bardon and those guys have been saying for 2 years, and actually confirms what we've been saying for 2 years. And then you got it. That's why we're highlighting this. What's he said?
Well, they've written the headline: "Fight to the last Ukrainian." That's what they're doing, and that's what this. That's all this extra aid that everybody's crowing about now is going to achieve. 100 million
from us, which is now over $1 billion in total. We've seen.
Yeah. So we're going to send them just enough weapons to keep fighting for a little bit longer. They don't, and he's acknowledging all the things that we've been saying and getting called Kremlin stooges for a couple of years, that they don't have the manpower to win. They don't have the industrial base. Russia's got superiority in numbers, weapons, capabilities. It's over.
And they always, remember, they always did. That was always true, but we were told until the last few months, for most of 2020, second half of 2022 and 2023, we were told the Ukrainians are winning. Yeah. And it was never true. Now the change of tone is right in the Fin review there.
Yeah. So it's, and again, Curran, is a pretty decent sort of a character. So it's, it's obvious, but obviously the whole edifice is crumbling. That the main, the chief editor particularly is a pretty unsavoury character, is prepared to have him publish a column like this in the first place, right?
All right. Next example is about the nest of Chinese spies. I mean, Russian spies. I mean, hang on. The nest of spies weren't Chinese or Russian.
No, it turns out they were from our like-minded democratic partner, India. If everybody remembers, a couple of years ago, right, Mike Burgess, or Gollum as we like to call him, the head of ASIO, was making these comments designed to sound like it was about China, how we've uprooted it and shown the door to this nest of spies who were getting into this, that, and the other thing, industrial espionage, defence acquisitions, blah, 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 blah.
And so instantly everyone assumed it was China, and so Burgess said, no, it's not China.
Yeah. And so then, it must have been Russia.
Must have been Russia.
Must have been one of those bad
Australian
guys.
Strategic
Maybe it was Iran. Maybe it was North Korea.
Peter Jennings from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute wrote, it has to be Russia.
Yep.
If it's not China. Because spying sees something like this really unprecedentedly evil thing. We never do it. Like the way we talk about it, we never do it. But it's done to us, and it's really, really bad. So therefore, if it's done, it must be done by these evil countries.
Yep. At the same time that they're telling you all about how we're going to build up the offensive cyber capability of the ASD and more resources to ASIS. Well, ASIS does foreign spying. That's what it's for, right?
So now we know it's India, but so there's a bit of egg on face, and you got a quote here.
Oh, yeah.
You got to hear this to believe
it. This is from the AFR also, a guy called Andrew Tillett, who's not a complete, well, in regard to Russia, he's a complete foaming at the mouth lunatic.
He gets you going every morning.
On China, he's less awful, although he doesn't have much competition, to live up to. In any case, he has been one of the ones yelling about China, at the slightest suggestion China might have done any of these things, right?
How evil.
This is what he says now. Some of the activities carried out by the Indians were pretty run-of-the-mill espionage, usually conducted by both friend and foe, trying to steal secrets on defence technology and trade relationships, cultivating politicians, monitoring the diaspora community. Wait, what?
Those three, like people, you gotta not let this get lost on you. Those three things are the things that we've had screamed in our face for 5 or 6 years the Chinese are doing to us.
Yeah, and they said it was tantamount to a declaration of war, and now it's run-of-the-mill. It's nothing to get worked up about.
Run-of-the-mill.
Although he does note that trying to find out information on airport security protocols veers into more nefarious territory. Yeah, does it what?
Something they haven't accused the Chinese of.
No.
All right, so here's the thing. We've established, I hope, that what we get from the government is a lot of propaganda, and especially on areas like foreign policy. So now, let's look at what's happened. So we had the stabbings in Sydney, and what we want to talk about now is how the Albanese government has seized on those stabbings to push a pre-existing agenda. That's the whole point here. It's not that you would... Of course they were going to respond to the stabbings. They might have even had a view of the video that they're having a fight with Twitter about. Although what's his name on Media Watch, Paul Barry came out and said even in the, it's not a nice video, but the bishop doesn't die, right? And in the overall scheme of things, there's a lot worse thing that's easily viewable online.
Well, I mean, apart from the fact that the stuff in the programming is all fake, there's more graphic violence on any movie played after 8:30 at night, right?
But just say like it was a genuine concern from law enforcement or whatever, and they could probably have even dealt with it in a private capacity to Twitter or X and say, look, can we just cool that, right? Because they can geo-block it in our country. That they do that, but instead of doing that,
well, Twitter did do that.
Well, exactly, Twitter did that. But instead of just handling it, instead of just treating this as a specific thing, what we want to highlight is they've seized on it because they had an agenda to seize on it. And what we're talking about is their misinformation and disinformation bill, which last year there was a big exposure draft consultation on and got smashed in the exposure draft consultation. So they kind of parked it, but they didn't really. And that's what you've written about this week, because Michelle Rowland and Albo have laid the foundation for this. What do they do?
Yeah. So Rowland's been going all over the place. We reported a little while ago.
She's the communications minister.
She was over in Belgium, hobnobbing with studying up, consulting with the people who developed their Digital Services Act over there. That's a lot of this same stuff. And they've had this thing, not even on the back burner. Is it something intermediate to the back burner? Anyway, they've been going on with this thing behind the scenes the whole time. And as is now obvious, they've been waiting for an opportunity. And I just want to talk about government misinformation. We would have all heard that they're complaining about how Twitter accounts and Telegram accounts misidentified the Bondi stabber as this local guy.
Yeah.
The government's been pushing that line.
Yep.
Channel 7 has just settled with the guy because they, for almost a whole day, kept misidentifying this local student as this different guy from a different state.
Mainstream media, not social media.
Mainstream media,
from this bill.
which is exactly. And they and the government, because they're trying to get money out of Meta, Facebook, and out of Twitter to post then especially Facebook, to post their news content and all of this stuff, right? So they've just been reporting this stuff, spinning it in such a way that this is just that nasty libertarian billionaire Elon Musk, right?
Yeah.
And it's not. They're standing on principle because they're saying, well, why should you be the police of the world? You know, we did what you asked, we took it down in your country.
Yeah.
And even Dutton agreed with them
Dutton,
on that.
That's right. Peter Dutton came out and said, yeah, we shouldn't be the police of the world. But that's probably him responding to the backlash on this, because he's just as guilty as Albo and Michelle Rowland on this.
Yeah. I mean, well, for starters, he appointed the lady who's made this order.
Julie Inman Grant.
that they're complaining about. But
he got his government got the misinformation, disinformation.
Yeah. They
bill
announced a bill along exactly the same lines 2 months before they lost the election in 2022. This would all be happening. Peter Dutton would still have his jackboots laced up tight and probably a peak cap by now if he was still Home Affairs or Defence Minister, right? Nothing, like Paul Keating once said, 93% of the machinery rolls on unhindered regardless of who's in office, right? Because they let it. And so, these attacks happen, and suddenly that becomes this is why we need these powers. And anti-encryption powers for the kids that they arrested, supposedly for planning a terrorist attack that they had admitted there was no actual attack planned.
Now, just before we get to that though, tell us about the Michelle Rowland's meeting with the British and her memorandum of understanding, because the British have they've taken a leading role in this. Yeah,
so the British, all these nastiest things always seem to start in London. So, funny that. Like, we call it the Anglo-American Empire for a reason.
Yeah, exactly.
So, in February, on one of this intermittent world tour she's been on, Michelle Rowland went and signed a memorandum of understanding with her British counterpart, Michelle Donnellan, Communications Secretary, whatever she's called over there. Cooperation on this stuff. You know, combating misinformation, online harms, where harms is never actually defined, so it's whatever you say it is. The need to create an independent regulator that would have be the sole arbiter of what is or is not true on the internet. So, Ministry of Truth, right?
Because that's the thing, it comes down to who decides what is misinformation, what is disinformation, what is harmful. Yeah. That's always been the issue with censorship. Who decides what constitutes what has to be censored, right? But what you're saying, Richard, is while we were under the impression the government had parked this...
Yeah, because they were saying, oh, well, we've listened to the feedback and we're redrafting the bill to address these concerns. And no, they're not.
They've gone and signed us up to international agreements.
Yeah. And what they do, and they've been doing this for years and years and years, especially since the 1980s, and we've, in the Alert article, I've linked to an article in The Spectator by 2 law professors going through this. And we've cited it before in the case of environmental law and other things. They will use any international convention, treaty, or just these MOUs because to invoke the external affairs power of Section 51, subsection 19, I think it is, of the Constitution, to claim powers over areas that the Constitution doesn't actually give them authority in.
2 words in the Constitution, external affairs. And we first saw this with the Franklin Dam case in 1983. They used 2 words to overrule the state government in Tasmania, and they've been doing it ever since. They say if we've signed a treaty, that gives us carte blanche. And so the warning is they're going to use the same thing now. Now here's the thing though, back to this idea of look, so they've done that. We thought they'd parked the bill. Instead, they've gone and made these international agreements, etc. And then this stabbing comes along, and so they've seized on it to exploit it, to capitalise it, because this is going to reignite this agenda. We have seen this before 100 times in the anti-terrorism field. Literally. And and you've been writing on it for well over a decade, this practice, but I was involved going back to 2001 with the first raft of anti-terrorism laws. And so there was always this great urgency, oh, we've got to have these laws, we've got to have these laws, we've got to keep Australians safe from attack, etc. So you've got some things to report on how this relates to this particular case. But first of all, let's run a clip from the National Press Club last week where the head of ASIO and the head of the AFP appeared at the press club to say, this was clearly coordinated with the government, right? It's all, we need these powers, we need these powers. And so a journalist from The Guardian got up And watch this very revealing exchange.
Paul Carp, next question.
Paul Carp from The Guardian. Thanks very much for your speeches. More than 5 years ago, Parliament passed the supposedly urgent legislation to help law enforcement agencies break encryption. I've got the latest data on how many times these new powers have been used, and you'll see that the technical assistance requests, which is the voluntary cooperation from the tech companies, reasonably well used, 66 times last financial year. The compulsory powers, technical assistance notices and technical capability notices, a big fat zero, all agencies, last financial year, the year before that. So my question, please, why are you asking the tech companies for more cooperation instead of escalating and using the powers that you already have to compel it?
I think you'll see in this financial year a 100% increase on that zero. That's one thing I'll say, and it has, so, you know, I don't want to go into details of that, but, you know, it goes back to the tech companies. You know, we just want what we currently have as far as that arrangement of them being able to share material and referrals to us that we can act on. So we don't know what we'd need to request if it goes dark, if you understand what I mean.
But 100% of zero is zero. So excuse me for being obtuse. Are you actually going to issue a technical assistance or technical capability notice?
Well, what I'm saying is I'm aware that there's already been one issue recently.
There's been one of those notices issued?
Yes.
And I'm not going to rule it out. Of course, we're here to ask for their help. We have good relationships with these companies. I'm here to ask for their help. And I will use the law if I need to, but I'm asking for their help because, as the Commissioner said, it's the way they design things we need their help on.
So if it's so dire and you're saying it takes up so many resources, though, only one from a layman like me seems low. Why only one? Well,
in my case, nearly
how many?
Almost 100% of my priority counter-terrorism, counter-espionage cases, we can't bust through this encryption when we have the warrant. That's got to be a problem for all Australians, not just my people.
So there you have it. Now you yourself wrote about that 5 years ago, that they need these emergency powers, right? So they can order tech companies to hand over this stuff, right? Order them, and he's pointing out they haven't even used them.
Yeah, even though they already could, all of these things, they just needed a warrant.
Yeah.
And no, we have to do it. It's urgent. We have to be able to do it without a warrant. Everything that they were complaining about were already crimes. Yep. Every single issue, you know, child pornography, you know, scams, terrorism. Well, yeah, they call anything and everything terrorism now if they decide to, but politically motivated violence is the traditional definition. Now they've tacked on religion or just ideology in general to it, so it means anything you want it to mean. And that was what they used to grab up these kids.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. They quickly labelled this attack by the one disturbed young man on the Bishop. That's a terrorist attack.
And he is mentally disturbed.
I saw the 7:30 report story this week with his parents, and his father was racked with sobs. I mean, they were not putting it on. They're totally distraught by what their son has done, right? But they're calling it a terrorist. They seize on it. This is a terrorist attack because once it's a terrorist attack, it has all these connotations, right? And so just describe the raids and what actually it means these kids have been arrested now.
Yeah, so they, and again, we've linked to an article, an analysis of this on a law blog in Sydney, but they've said this one kid who actually went and stabbed this bishop, and again, didn't kill him. He's back doing his services online like he's been doing for years, with a patch over one eye, but that's it. And he's basically fine. Because he's in one of these online chat groups with these other kids, well, they get into there. If they weren't, and again, you have to remember that intelligence officers, agents get in there and they're employed to egg people on, get in, oh, we've infiltrated this ring of potential terrorists, when they're the ones these suggestible, screwed up kids, and they're leading them on with this stuff, and then they arrest them.
Proven. It was proven in the FBI was doing it in America for years and years and years, probably still is. Absolutely proven.
Yep, and in Melbourne here, what was it, last year? Early this year? Another example of it, counter-terrorism police creating terrorists. And so did that happen in this case? I suspect we'll find out sooner or later if it did. But yeah, so they've gone around, they've deployed 400 counter-terrorism police to raid 13 locations. 7 of them are the family homes of this alleged terrorists' alleged juvenile associates, the youngest of whom is 14 years old and is now going to be potentially jailed for decades because he was in a chat group and said something about jihad, lol. Yeah. That was the quote, lol at the end. You know, is he joking? We don't know. And he was in a chat group with some other kid who went and travelled more than 50 kilometres to stab somebody because he thought he'd insulted his religion, supposedly.
And that's the disturbing part. So by calling it terrorism and then bringing all the power of the more than 100 anti-terrorism laws that have been rammed through since 2001, all of with the same urgency like the misinformation, disinformation, but we need these to keep us safe, which the Guardian journalists proved once they got them, they use them if they bloody well feel like it, right? But instead of just treating these as a crime and looking at these kids and saying, you know, what's the case with these kids? Do they need help? Do they need to be punished or whatever? All the power of the counter-terrorism regime comes down on them and they face sometimes life in prison or decades and decades and decades in prison for this, all for nothing more than thought crimes. Yep. They haven't done anything except for that one. Well,
and another kid who supposedly downloaded, he's charged with having downloaded terrorist ISIS materials off the internet. Everybody else, it's just preparing for an act of terrorism, which the Deputy Commissioner of the Federal Police said straight up that there was no actual timeline, location, target planned. Yeah. It was just these kids saying, oh, hey, let's do a terrorist attack maybe sometime. I feel like killing someone, all these sort of things.
Now, and that's disturbing.
Stuff that kids say, whether they're serious or not, right? But I want to say and they're not bothering to assess that.
But I want to say 2 things about that stuff, because it is disturbing. But I want to say 2 things. We know the Assyrian community fairly well. They actually do not regard this as a terrorist attack.
No.
Because it was a crime by an idiot, a disturbed young man. Here's the second thing though. For the last 6 months, all those young men in Western Sydney who are Muslims have been given the clear message from our government, from the American government, from the British government, that their lives are worth less than white people.
Yeah, or just worthless altogether.
Because of what's happening out of Gaza. Gaza is telling them, the mass slaughter of children in Gaza is telling them that their lives are not worth anything. That's what they're being told. That's the message they're getting. That is, if they're being radicalised, that is what's radicalising them. And this is the problem with this misinformation, disinformation stuff, because the government is doing the things that are destroying the public's confidence and trust in the government, and instead of stopping doing those things, they're blaming the collapse in trust on misinformation, disinformation by foreign actors if they can, and giving themselves more laws to keep doing the things that's causing the collapse of trust. And that's why we have to fight this very, very hard. So we've covered it today. We've put out a release, it's on our website on this. When the bill gets put into Parliament, we'll have an opportunity to hit it hard through the Senate inquiry. Be on the lookout for this. We cannot let them because we're on social media now. And when they write these powers, they're very broad and they'll include the ability to shut down a discussion like this as well. All right? So we have to fight this very, very hard. The future of our country is at stake here. Free speech is a principle that's even enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But I'm rushing a bit there because we're actually running out of time. We can see the countdown. Richard, thank you very much again for that. Read Richard's article in the Alert Service. Thanks for tuning in. Enjoy the victory over the banks. Tune in next week for more.
Authorised by Robert Barwick, Citizens Party, Melbourne.